Okay, so good morning, everyone in person and everyone online. Thanks a lot for the ones in person. I know it was a tough morning because of the heavy rain. So today we have the honor of having Trang Hoang, who is a research economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors at the International Finance Division Trade and Quantitative Studies section. So she graduated in 2021 from Vanderbilt University, and her main research interests include international trade, development, and applied econometrics. And today she's going to present a very interesting paper on trade wars and rumors of trade wars. So we're going to have 1 hour. We're going to end 10 minutes later. As usual, feel free to jump with your questions. And thanks a lot for being here, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Augustine. And thanks for inviting me to present this paper. So this work is co-authored with Carter Mix, my colleague at the Federal Reserve Board. And as the usual disclaimer goes, this paper does not present the views of the Federal Reserve or anyone affiliated with the Federal Reserve. Okay, so the overarching goal of this paper is to study the bilateral trade war between the US and China that started in 2018. And because of this trade war, the average bilateral tariff between these two countries increased by more than 12%. So we want to ask what is the effects of these tariffs and Asians' expectations about these tariffs on aggregate outcomes. And of course, we're not the first people to ask these questions, but we contribute by focusing on two novel satellite facts that have not been explained in the literatures. So the first one, we document some unusual behavior about tariff elasticity of US import from China. In particular, we saw that the trade response of US import was delayed in the first 3 years of the trade war and then increased in 2021 and 22. So our model is going to have dynamic features that would be able to account for this unusual behavior of the trade elasticity. And secondly, we document a reallocation of imports from the US to China after the trade war. And so this fact motivated us to develop a multi-region general equilibrium model. So just a little bit more about the model. There are three key features in our model. The first one, I already mentioned, the model is going to be dynamics. It's going to be macro and micro or firm levels dynamics. The macro side of the models is built on standard international macro models. For example, because Kehoe and Kitland, 1992. So the model incorporates capital and net foreign asset accumulations and endogenous trade imbalance. And those are going to be very important for the general equilibrium effects. Beside the macro dynamics, our model also includes firm level dynamics and export dynamics. So that's going to come from the sunk cost of exporting, similar to the model in Das Robust and Taibu 2007. So if you're familiar with this firm level dynamics in trade, you know that the sunk cost of exporting going to create a gradual trade response to tariff, and also create a roles for expectations to affect the trade response and also the aggregate dynamics. The second feature of the model is that's going to be a multi-regions general equilibrium model. So in particular, we're going to have three regions, the US, China, and the rest of the world. We can make it more disaggregate, right? Break down the rest of the world into even further regions. But for now, our focus is just on the effect on US and China. And so because of this feature, even though the policy that we focus on is bilateral, just between the US and China, but the impact is going to be multilateral, meaning that it's going to be effects on third-party countries. And finally, in our model, we're going to include a roundabout productions with three different types of goods capital goods, consumer goods, and materials. And because of these features, we're gonna have an indirect effect of the tariff on one type of goods on input prices indirectly. This is similar to the result in Caliendo and Paro's 2015, even though our Raobao productions is a lot less complex than their intersectoral linkages. And we will also have heterogeneous tariffs on different type of goods. And in our calibration exercise, we will match the composition of bilateral trade and tariff across different good types. Okay, so that's our model. We also have 3 key results from our quantitative exercise. First, we find that the tariffs are initially expected to be temporary. And we also find that expectation about future tariffs play a very important role in shaping the dynamics of the aggregate outcomes. Second, we find that the initial trade imbalances between the US and China generates very different terms of trade movements in the US and China. In particular, the tariffs between US and China serve both as a supply and demand shocks. But because China was a net exporter, the demand shock dominates the supply shocks. Whereas for the US, the supply shock dominates. And that creates opposite term of trade movement for the US and China, and that also explains the global reallocation that I mentioned on the previous slides. And finally, we found that the tariffs reduce welfare in both countries, but a lot more for China than for the US. And this welfare difference comes from the size asymmetries, meaning that the US is a lot more bigger economies, and also the term of trade movements. So those 2 factors account for 89% of this welfare difference between the US and China. We also did do a comparisons exercise. Basically, we recalculate this welfare effect in a static model, where we remove both the macro and the micro dynamics. And we found that in this environment, the welfare effect is a lot smaller than our baseline estimate. Then this shows the importance of dynamics in estimating this welfare effect. All right, so yes.
Just ask one, not really at all in this literature, but I just was curious because I was just reading some more journalistic pieces on it about, thinking about one of the responses, for instance, of someone like China has been that, given that tariffs are imposed based on your country of origin, that they have moved a lot, that investments, say, in Vietnam has just gone up phenomenally in the last few years, right? So does your model also account for these kind of features to kind of calculate welfare losses and gains then?
So yes and no. So in our model, the general equilibrium effect is gonna create this relocations of goods from China to Vietnam. And potentially a lot of those goods gonna end up in the US, but it's just a price effect, right? When China subjects to tariff, right, there's a lower demand for Chinese good in the US, and therefore lower the prices of Chinese good. And as a result, other countries are going to buy more Chinese good because of the lower prices. But that generally just a price effect. What you were talking, or what the media is maybe referring to, is a relocation of productions, right? Maybe company move production factories from China to Vietnam and other countries. We don't have that in our model. But in our empirical exercise, we do account for FDIs, and we show that even after controlling for this FDI movement, there's still some pure relocation in the trade flows. Yeah.
Just a follow-up on that question. I mean, I see there are welfare losses in China and the US, but will be there welfare gains for the rest of the world? Are there winners from these tariffs?
Yes. So in the baseline, when we just lump together every other country into one block, the welfare changes for them is very small. But we did have another exercise when we have Europe versus emerging Asia versus Canada, Mexico, and we do see that some of the other country, I have to refresh my mind. I think it's the North America block and Asia benefit a lot from that. So there was some of that welfare gains by other countries. But I would say that the model is not the best to account for or to really look into what regions gain or lost from this particular trade war, because to have this really nice differentiation between, say, Asia and Europe, right? We also need to characterize what makes Asia different from Europe. I mean, we really don't have that in the models. The rest of the world is just one block. And the only difference, if we break down this region to smaller region, is that their initial trade imbalance with China's differences are different, and also like the size, the economies are different between different regions. But we would need something more like where are they along the supply chains? What is the manufacturing capacity? How much it can absorb demand that coming from China, etc., etc. But we don't have a lot of that, so we decide that that's not going to be the focus of this paper.
Perfect.
Any other questions? All right. So in the next few slides, I'm going to give a quick refresher on the US-China trade war. For those who work on this topic, you probably heard this so many times, but just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So in 2017, quickly after Trump took office, the USTR begins an investigation into Chinese supposedly unfair trade practice. And in March 2018, it declared that they find unfair practices. And June 2018, there's first wave of tariffs. Both US and China imposed 25% tariff on 50 billions in both directions, right? So that was the beginning of a exchange, tit and tat exchange between the US and China. The next several years, there's several waves of tariff, as you are all aware. And by the end of 2019, the US and China signed a phase one deal, which was in effect in early 2020. So that deal includes some tariff reductions on the US side, and China promised to purchase a lot more US goods. But since then, the tariff has basically unchanged. So there's two features of this trade war that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is that there was a asymmetry in the tariff increases across different good types. So in this table, I show the additional tariff imposed by the US and China, and also the import share by end-use good categories. So that capital goods, consumer goods, and materials. So as you can see from the US side, the US import a lot of capital goods from China. So 39% of US import from China are capital goods. Sorry, it's not looking. But the US imposed quite high additional tariff on capital goods, so 15% additional tariffs, whereas consumption goods only subject to 8% additional tariff. On the China side, capital good is not really important in terms of its import from the US. Materials account for 70%, but capital goods only 23%. It's also subject to the lowest additional tariffs among all three categories. So this asymmetry in the tariff increases and also the trade composition across different goods categories is going to be keys in several aggregate dynamics I'm going to show you later. Another features of the trade war is that there was a lot of uncertainty about how persistent this tariff is going to be, especially at the beginning of the trade war. For example, before Biden was the president, right, he regularly criticized the trade war that Trump imposed, saying that it's not the good way to deal with unfair trade practices in China. There was also pressures to reduce tariff due to inflation in his first year of office, and also supply chain disruption, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of talk about whether Biden's going to remove this tariff when he became president, but eventually he did not touch the tariff at all. And you also know that in May this year, he imposed additional tariff on China's goods, but a lot smaller in scale compared to this 2018-2019 tariff. So that was So that this uncertainty of the tariffs is very important for the firm dynamics. Even though the tariff may not change, but the expectations about what the future tariff is going to be is going to affect the firm decision to enter the market or not, right? So in this paper, we're going to account or hopefully account for that. And in particular, we're going to actually use the data and tease out what is the firm expectation at every single point in time about what the future tariff is going to be, and use that expectations to for our quantitative exercise. So in the next few slides, oh yes.
So certain types of tariffs are used for industrial policy. So for example, like semiconductors,
Yes.
they put tariff on it, and this would it's part of a larger industrial policy to develop the semiconductor industry at home. My question is that obviously it will change, the expectation will change based on different industries. Do you account for that in your model?
Short answer is no. Very good questions. So I think your question is that certain industry are a lot more sensitive. Maybe they're strategic industry, and therefore firms should expect that they are subject to higher tariffs in the future. So I totally agree. My read of the moment, so in 2018, 2019, was that there's a lot more China is bad, we need to discipline them, let's impose this many tariffs on almost everything, right? 2/3 of Chinese goods are subject to tariff. And a lot less talk about semiconductors, the crucial industry, EV, the crucial industry, less impose tariff. That is more of a Biden policy than a Trump policy. So I don't think that was a concern at that point. Obviously, we're thinking about 2024 or the next year, the talk of EV, the talk of semiconductors is going to be a lot more crucial. But I don't think that was the talk of this episode. Okay. All right. So if there's no other questions, I'm going to move on and talk about the global trade patterns in the trade war. So on the chart, I'm showing the China shares of U.S. good imports from the early 1990s up to the recent period. And as you can see that after the start of the U.S.-China trade war, the China share sharply declines, right, from 22% in 2017 down to only 14% in 2023. Very sharp declines in a very short amount of time. And this is in stark contrast with the three decades preceding this trade war. China was growing consistently from a very small player in the 1990s into the U.S. biggest suppliers of goods imports in 2022. And so there's been quite a few papers that study this patterns, and the conclusion is that this decline was mostly driven by the U.S. tariffs. So just another way to see that point is I break down the U.S. import from China from the rest of the world into goods that are subject to tariff and goods that are not subject to tariff. And you can see that one of these declines concentrated in tariff goods, whereas for non-tariff goods, the growth rate of U.S. import from China versus U.S. import from the rest of the world is pretty much similar during this period of time.
Although even for unaffected goods for a brief period did go down sharply, no?
Yes, so that is fair. There could be some spillover effect, maybe firmer like, oh wow, like will there be any tariff on the rest of the non-tariff goods as well? Or it could be other factors, so we're not sure. But when people have done causal exercise, they do find that yes, tariff have damaging effects on the U.S. import from China. So for whatever reasons, for this short period of time when unaffected goods decline, we're not clear. But you can see very strikingly from this graph is that the affected good was clearly declined after the trade war. Okay. All right. So we just want to be a lot more explicit about the effect of tariff. So here we're gonna estimate the tariff elasticity of U.S. import from China. And to do so, we collect a panel data of monthly U.S. Monthly bilateral trade data for U.S. China and a panel of countries that do not have trade agreement with U.S. and China. And the point of this is that this country is going to serve as the baseline, right? And we expect that there's no tariff changes between the U.S. and China and these countries, so that they serve as the comparisons for trade between the U.S. and China. And the data is monthly, but we're gonna aggregate up to annual, and we ship the year, so that it start in July every year, so that it's aligned with the start of the trade war. So 2018 is gonna be from July 2018 to June 2019. And here's our specifications. The dependent variable is the level of import from exporter J's to importer I for products P in year T, right? The key variable here is the key, independent variable is going to be the change in tariff that U.S. imposed on China, denoted by tau, interacting with an indicator that take a value of 1 if the importer is U.S. and China is the exporters. And so this beta here is going to capture basically the effects of the U.S. Tariff on China on the U.S. import from China for that particular goods. And of course, there's other factors that may affect this trend, right? This could be COVID, right? The U.S. demands certain goods during COVID, for example, household goods, furniture, toys, video game, phones. We all know that. And China also produced particular type goods that with very high demand, for example, PPEs.
Mm-hmm.
So for this reason, we also account for extensive set of fixed effects. We have imported products time fixed effects, exported product time fixed effects, and import-exporter fixed effects. Okay, so here's our result for the trade elasticity. The blue line shows the point estimate for betas at different point in times, and the gray shade area is the 95% confidence interval. So what you see is that in the first year, there's an immediate response. The elasticity is about 2.9, and 5 years after that, it go up to 5 or more than 5. So basically, there's this, the short run elasticity is different from or smaller than the long run elasticity. So this is consistent with a lot of the dynamics response that you've seen. Yes.
And in terms of magnitudes, how should I think about it? So let's say you think about the fact that the argument is often that a place like United States is so vested in China because of long run investments, production movement is a bit different. So if you would look at the other, I'm sure there must be earlier work which looks at how does what are the elasticities of tariffs, right? So what are they much lower than what were normal ballpark estimates given the kind of deep engagement like everybody keeps speaking about, or what do you find there?
Yeah, so good questions. The comparison across different estimate is somewhat nuanced depending on exactly what they estimate. Is there going to be so this estimation this elasticity captures the elasticity of substitution between China and other foreign countries.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, when we look at foreign versus foreign, substitution is higher than foreign versus domestic. So sometimes you see the elasticities for foreign versus domestics, right? And that is lower than the foreign versus foreign. So I would say that the short run elasticity, which is 2.9, is somewhat in line with the literatures that estimate the foreign versus foreign elasticity substitutions. So that is the short run. In the long run, I don't think we are reaching the long run yet, so we really don't know what's gonna go to, but there's some discussions on whether it's 10, 15s or around that range. So I would say that in terms of magnitudes for the short run elasticity, we are not far off from what people have already estimated in other settings.
Which is surprising or not, according to you?
So I would say, I think you was coming from the point that US is depending on China so much, so it's harder for the US to replace China.
For instance,
Yes. My point is that that could be true, but there's also you already point out that there's other countries that are replacing China, and Vietnam and maybe India or Mexico, right? So to the point that these countries produce similar, they may produce more expensive goods, but they produce similar baskets of goods, right? That would also allow them to be a natural substitutions for Chinese goods. So there's different factors that affect why countries might or may not be substitute for China's, but the study said that we observed prior to the trade war is that China is just the lowest cost or the most efficient producer, and therefore we see a lot of concentrations of US goods in China. But it doesn't mean that other countries cannot replace China, right? So there's a distinction between what the equilibrium would be and what could be the alternative equilibrium. Okay. All right. Any other questions on this? Oh, sorry, I forgot. Very key point about this, right? So we see that the initial response is lower than what we see 5 years out into the trade war. But one key features or one unusual features that I want to highlight is that the response in the first 3 years, right, 2018 to 2020, there was no change in the elasticity. They basically very much stable. And then the elasticity increased in 2021 and further increased in 2022. So this is a bit unusual because if we just have a typical dynamics or a dynamic model with just some costs, we should expect a somewhat more monotonous or more gradual increase in the elasticity. But what we see here is that the elasticity was stalling for the first 3 years and then increased in 2021.
And do you have some insight of what?
Yes, we're gonna explain.
Okay,
it.
okay.
Yes, there's the point for why I'm showing you this.
Okay.
It's not just for fun. Yes.
COVID-19 shutdowns, basically when everything shut down, China shut down, China couldn't manufacture anymore.
Yes, so that's a very good point, and we should account for that with the fixed effect here. So this is the exporter products time fixed effect. You should account for, let's say, a particular factories in China is shut down and cannot produce that particular good. So that should capture that here, right? The only thing that it cannot capture is that this particular factory that produces good P, but only for the US is shut down, and therefore only the US cannot import from China for that good. Then we cannot capture it. But we also don't think that's that common. But yeah, so absolutely, COVID is always an issues in this period of time. But we think that potentially we account for that with our specifications. All right. So any other questions here? So just to give you some hint about what we're gonna do, we're gonna take this elasticity very seriously, and when we go to the calibrations exercise, we're gonna match the elasticity implied by the model with this one. We're gonna generate the expectations of future types so that the model elasticity match the estimated elasticity. Okay. So I'm gonna show you what does this imply about firm expectations, right? All right, so that's the first style effect. And then for the second style effect, we want to look into the global reallocations after the trade war. So we want to compare the growth of global imports from the US and China versus China before and after the trade war. And to do so, we're going to collect data on imports by the world largest 30 importers by their 2017 values from the US, China, from the rest of the world at HS 6-digit level. And the outcome variable that we're interested in is the annualized growth rate during the 5 years prior to the trade war and the 5 years prior to this, after the start of the trade war. So I'm going to explain a bit more detail exactly what I mean by this. But here's our baseline specification. So this is like a very simple two-way fixed effects right here. You have import growth as the dependent variables. And again, I'm going to explain how do I calculate that. And the first variable here is basically just an indicator equal 1 if the import is from China and the year is after 2016. The second one is just whether it's equal to, sorry, the exporter is the US and it's after 2016 and we have exporter fixed effect and time fixed effects. Okay. And so the reference group is going to be import from the rest of the world before 2017, right? And the way that we interpret this data is going to be the differential growth rate of import from China and the US compared to the growth, import growth from the rest of the world after the trade war compared to before the trade war. Sorry, it's a lot of differences. Basically, it's the differences in differences, if you want to think that way. Okay, so how do we calculate the import growth? We're going to collapse our sample period into two periods.
Can I also ask you one more thing?
Yes.
Maybe so here I can see the fact that you included like your time fixed effects, right? But I mean, you could imagine like the scope, like the period you're going to span.
Yes, but go ahead.
You're gonna talk about that. Then I won't ask you now. Okay.
Yes. So on the next slide, this is just the starting specification. And they're gonna add more and add more, add more. It's just too much to write in one equation. So
okay.
I decide not to do that here. But I'm going to show you on the next slide what we actually do.
Okay.
All right. So how do I calculate the import growth? So I'm going to have two periods, 2012 to 2016, and then 2017 to 2022. And then within the first period, right, I'm going to look at the difference between the lock import in the last year minus the lock import in the first year, annualize it, and multiply by 100. So the way that you interpret ADA is just going to be the growth rate, the percent change in growth rate, to be exact. Okay. So column 1 here is the result for our baseline specification with just the exporter and US fixed effects. You can see that the coefficient on the China variable is positive, whereas the coefficient on the US variable is negative. So the way we interpret this is that supposedly global import from the rest of the world has a constant growth between the 5 years before the trade war and the 5 years after the trade war, 5 years after the trade war. Then the global import from China is growing 2% faster than global import from the rest of the world, whereas global import from the US is growing 1.4% slower than import from the rest of the world, right? And as you already mentioned, there are multiple other, a lot of different stories that may account for this trend. Now, one trend is FDIs, right? Again, we already talked about this. That is potentially companies moving from China to Vietnam and from China to Mexico. But this country are still using a lot of inputs from China, and therefore it's going to be a higher demand by Vietnam and Mexico for Chinese inputs, right? So that could potentially increase demand for Chinese goods. So we account for that by including FDI movement from China to other countries and also from the US to other countries in the second column here. And we do see that has some positive effect, but the coefficients on our main variables are still pretty much intact. Then in the next few columns, we also account for the story that maybe the countries that are buying from China just growing at a faster rate than the countries that are trading with the US, and that leads to this relocation that we're looking at. Or it could potentially be because the products that China are producing just have a higher demand than the products that the US typically producing. So we account for imported years, product years, fixed effect in the next field column. And again, across different specification, we still see a very strong patterns of relocations of global import from the US to what China's. And another interesting result is that we did the same exercise for tariff goods and non-tariff goods, and we basically obtained very similar result like this table here. And so this is not a causal exercise for the tariff on global relocations, but the point of this exercise is that we do see this relocation after the trade war, and it cannot be fully explained by a lot of other stories. It cannot be explained by FDI, cannot be explained by imported growth trends or product growth trends, right? And we see this for both tariff and non-tariff goods.
And sorry for being so. Can you tell me how should I interpret the coefficients and what is it exactly capturing? Will you tell us again?
Yes. So this is, for example, in last column,
Yeah.
right? The coefficient is 2.6. So the way that I interpret it is that supposedly third countries import from the rest of the world is, say, grow at a constant rate in both the first and the second period. Then the coefficients on the China here would imply that global import from China is growing 2.6% faster than import from the rest of the world. In 2017 and during 2017, 2022.
China imports to the globe.
So China export to this 30 importers.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I only look at 30 importers, but they account for about 60% global imports. Right? Yes. So
and the US
and the US would be similar. That is after the trade war, the US should say that global import from the US grew at 1.5% slower than global import from the rest of the world.
To the 30 biggest importers in India.
Yes. Yeah.
And okay, that's the and the intuition behind this. You have something also to say?
So the model is going to explain this.
Okay.
Yes. And just you give a preview. What the model is going to generate is that because of the trade war, term of trade in China is going to decline, and term of trade in the US is going to improve. And when that happens, the US is going to buy more from other countries, and the other countries are going to buy less from the US just because US goods become more expensive. And the rest of the world going to buy more from China because good in China is less expensive. So I'm going to explain the term of trade movement, and the model going to generate this global trade pattern that very much in line with the empirical exercise. Yes.
Apart from the 102, 0.786, most of the coefficients are quite large. Any possible explanation?
Sorry, what variable are you talking about?
Model 2, only 0.7 FDI.
Oh, the FDI.
Only 0.786.
Right.
The explanation why all our variables have quite big coefficient.
Yeah, okay. I haven't thought about that, to be honest. But that's good observations. So I guess, after column 2 is when we account for the importer year fixed effect and products year fixed effects. So could potentially be some thing in particular about the country that China generate FDI into, like the country that China invests in. Maybe they just growing at a different rate compared to country that US invests in. So that's just something particular about this different group of countries that receive investment from China versus the US. But to be honest, I haven't looked into that. Yeah.
As a follow-up question, in the model, are you actually capturing elasticity on both sides?
So the elasticity that I showed you earlier is just on the US side. We didn't do elasticity of Chinese import from the US because of phase 1 deal. I mentioned earlier, China agreed to purchase a lot more US good in 2020. So that really messed up with the elasticities So what we're gonna mesh is basically just the US elasticities and not Chinese elasticities. Okay.
I suspect that you should also look through the measurement of the variables, particularly when you have bigger plants. Also,
Okay.
Scaling of the variables.
Okay.
Scaling is not balanced, then you have this bigger.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. We will look into that. Thanks. Okay. So any other questions for this section? Okay. Awesome. So that's the two key style effects that we want to document and focus on. And so now we're going to move on to, I'm going to move to the model and our calibrations, pretty much going to tie to the style effects. Okay. So again, it's going to be multi-regions models. We're going to have US, China, the rest of the world. There are three players, three actors in this model, the household, a final good producer, and intermediate good producers in each regions, right? A representative household is going to choose consumptions, labor, capitals, and bond investment to maximize their expected lifetime utilities. There's going to be adjustment cost on the bonds and investment, on capital investment. So the household problem is essentially a consumption saving, the choice between consumption and saving in each period. And pretty much coming from the standard international macro literatures. And if you're familiar, you know that this consumption saving choice is gonna give rise to an endogenous trade imbalance across different countries just because households have different saving rates, etc., etc. And the second player is find a good producer, and it's going to be a group that make consumption good, a group that make capital goods, and another group that make material goods, right? And for each type outputs, they're going to use either home or foreign intermediate goods to produce the output. And the types are going to differ by the end use. The consumption good and capital goods are sold to the household, but material goods are sold to the intermediate goods producer that I'm going to talk about later. And so the tariff on materials goods going to go into the price of input for intermediate good producer indirectly. Okay. And so so the final goods producers where we have this roundabout productions. And finally, we have the intermediate good producers, and this guy is going to be exporters, and this is where the firm level dynamics happening. So this guy use capital goods, labor, and material goods to produce their output. And they have to pay, they can choose whether to just sell in the domestic market or sell in the export market. If they choose to export, they have to pay a fixed cost of exporting and a variable cost of exporting. And this fixed and variable cost is on average going to be lower for incumbent exporter than for new exporters. And because of this fact, the export decisions dynamics. And finally, firms gonna choose to enter if their expected values is larger than their fixed cost of entries. And so we're gonna mesh the tariffs in the model so that it mesh with the exact tariff that US and China impose on each other across different goods type. So as I already mentioned, for the US side, there's a lot more emphasis on materials and capital goods, whereas consumption goods are subject to the lowest level. But on the China side, consumption goods and materials are subject to a higher tariffs compared to capital goods. So this is going to have, this asymmetry is going to have implication for the investment dynamic in each country. Okay. And so, okay, so next I'm going to talk about the calibration for the tariff elasticity. So that's going to go back to the expectations that I mentioned earlier. And this is also going to be the most important step in our calibrations. Okay, so the goal is that we want to choose the path of expectations about future tariffs so that the model elasticity match the elasticity that we estimated from the data. And so to do so, we first assign a simple process for the tariff in the model. So tariff is gonna follow a stochastic process. Current tariff is very similar to last year tariff, plus an error term. Epsilon C here is a normal distributed error term, and also contemporaneous shock to tariff, and only affect current tariffs. And then we have this expectational error, epsilon E here, and this is going to be an error terms to the future tariffs, right? And only affect the tariff 1 year ahead. And so this epsilon E here is what we're going to choose to maximize, to minimize the distance between the tariff, the elasticity estimated from the data and the elasticity implied by the models. And we also assume that there's no expectations, there's no anticipation of tariff in the first year. Okay, so basically the error term is 0 in the first year. Okay, so here is the tariff elasticity estimated by the data and the actual tariff. Okay, and then here is what we estimate with the model for elasticity and the part of expectations. But first, let me explain how can we read the right panels. Okay, so the black line is the actual tariff part, and the red line is going to make expectations about future tariff. So at every point in time, for example, if we look at 2018, right, it's going to show what the agents expect about future tariff. So if you follow the red line starting in 2018 here, you can see that the agents expect a full reversal of tariff in the future years. And we go to 2019 and 2020, same thing happens, either a full or a partial reversal of tariffs, right? But then in 2021 and 2021, agents expect a higher tariff in the future. And we assume that after 2022, the expectation is pretty much in line with the actual tariff part. Okay, so why do we get this particular expectation part? Remember that the elasticity in the first 3 years was stalled, right? Basically, there was very little change in the elasticity in the first 3 years, even though tariff actually increased. And the reason for this is because agents expect that tariff is going to be removed in the very following years. And so they would basically just delay their response, right?
And again, maybe that's my naiveness in asking this, but I mean, of course, you're fitting now the data to explain that pattern. So of course, that's one logical way of thinking about it. But what if you would, and then maybe your model already does, what if you incorporate something like, what's the time that it takes me to kind of shift around, So in that sense, again, you can think that elasticity remains kind of flat for a time period before I figure out, so that's this initial movement that I make where I cut to the capacity I can, and then, just a time period before I can find other sources, set it up, and that's when you observe this increase in elasticity. So nothing to do with expectations at all, but it's just a question of like these kind of iceberg costs, right? Of not transportation here, but of reallocation. So does your model account for that in some sense?
That's a very good question. So the assumption for the time to shift things around is basically 1 year. The sunk cost and variable cost has this 1 year lag, right? Like actually I don't have that equation in the model. And it's assumed to be the same every year. So I think your question is that if we change that time lapse, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we can mesh this one. So that's a great question. And so questions could be, every year we have a different, maybe the first year is longer, and then the next year we study something and we shorten the time to.
Exactly. You could imagine, right? First you hit the shock, and once you're prepared for it, then your time to adjustment speeds up or whatever.
Yeah. So that's a good question. Then I have to think more about how we gonna address this. the things that I want to point out here is that, the sunk cost or the firm dynamics has been around, like, many papers look into that, and we have looked into that in different situations. And we have not seen this type of behavior in other situations, meaning the stalling of trade response in the first years, and then this increase in, in the fourth and fifth year. So that was unusual, even though the sunk cost idea has been around for a while, then back from Dax Roberts in Taibu in 2007. So if it's always been the case that the time lag is different across different years, then we should have seen similar response in other situations in previous settings. But the point of this paper is that this is unusual. And it's unusual because the tariff there was a lot of uncertainty about the tariff at the beginning. But then in 2021, firm pretty much has somewhat correct expectations about the permanence of the tariff, and therefore they start to respond more. And that's when you see the increase in tariff elasticity. So I see your point, and hopefully I can convince you that, if it's always been the case that the sunk costs just have different lags in different years, then we should have always seen this type of response.
Yes and no. And I mean, I buy your argument to a certain extent, but also that's why we talk a lot more about this China-US relationship, given that the extent of engagement was kind of much more deeply engaged compared to what the other aspects of relationships and trade that you might have thought about. So it's not an apple. So kind of saying, hey, that's what I found. It's like saying that's what I found in Ghana and that's what I should expect in Sweden, right?
Yeah.
That's not how we would make a micro argument. So that's the only reason I'm saying that given the special case of it, I would need something more to convince me that, that the other behavior that we observe from past data can be applied as an apples to apples case when I'm thinking about, what has been one of the most deep relationships in terms of trading happening. But
No, I totally agree with your point that it could be something else. So another thing you mentioned is that maybe the sunk cost change, maybe become more difficult over time. But we say my thinkings right now, and of course I need to spend more time on this, is that it's a lot faster to change expectation than changing sunk cost. So this kind of annual adjustment is probably easier, that firm just adjust their expectations. And we see that clearly in the data. Instead of, firm actually subject to a different sunk cost that change every year. That could be very difficult to plan.
Yeah, maybe something that could be kind of help you back up your story. I don't know, but maybe there were industry surveys carried out which asked people what do you think is going to happen to the tariffs in your sector? And then, if you show me hey, the variance or uncertainty to start off was much larger, and that data point fits your story, that would buy me a lot of credibility in terms of buying into this mechanism that you want to highlight in some sense,
Okay, yeah. Very good suggestions. Thank you so much. Great. All right. So any other questions about this calibration before I move on? Okay. All right. So now that we have calibrated the expectation about future tariffs, let me talk about our quantitative exercise. The key result here is going to be the term of trade effects of tariff on US and China. Essentially, the tariff that US and China impose on each other serves both as a negative supply shocks and also as a negative demand shocks, right? So when tariffs imposed on imports, they're going to increase the cost of inputs and therefore raising domestic prices. So this supply shock is going to increase domestic prices and increase term of trade for that countries. But when tariff imposed on export, right, it's going to decrease foreign demands and therefore lower prices in the domestic market and therefore lower the term of trade. Okay, so for China, because China just export a lot more to the US than its import from the US, so the demand shock dominates the supply shock. And as a result, the ratio of prices to wages fall and term of trade for China depreciates. The opposite is true for the US. The US import a lot more from China than its export, and therefore the supply shock dominates. That leads to an increase in prices inside the US, and therefore increase the term of trade for the US. And so this term of trade movement is gonna, oh, sorry. So this is basically that, but in a figure. The blue line is the term of trade for the US over time, and the red line, the term of trade for China over time. So as you can see that in the long run, the term of trade for the US improved, but decline for China here. There's a hint in 2021. So this is when the Asian shift their expectation, right? Before that, they was expecting that the tariff's gonna be reversed. And then after 2021, they expect the tariff's gonna stay permanent, right? So before 2021, there was a very fast decline in terms of trade for China. And the reason is because for US buyers, especially of capital goods, when they expect that the price of capital is gonna be lower next year, right? They're gonna wait and delay their investment, and therefore they're gonna aggressively run down their capital stocks, and as a result, lower the demand for Chinese capital goods that supposed to be exported into the US. And so that explains the kinks. So this term of trade movement also have very important implication for global trade across different regions. So for the US, because term of trade increased, it's going to import more from the rest of the world. For China, because term of trade declines, going to import less from the rest of the world. And for the rest of the world, they're going to import more from China because goods are cheaper in China now, but less from the US because goods are more expensive in the US. So that creates this relocations of global import from the US to China that we have observed in our imperial gold society. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to move on to the aggregate effects, in particular on welfare, aware that I'm running out of time. So I'm going to be very fast here. So the magnitude welfare effects is going to rely on the size of the economy in terms of trade movement, but the shape of the transition dynamics is going to depend on the expectation about future tariffs. And so we measure welfare as a percentage of increase to steady state consumption that make for Asian difference between tariff highs and no tariff high. And we see that for the US, the welfare loss is about 0.58. Well, for China, it's a lot bigger, about twice as big. And the difference is become a lot smaller when we remove the initial trade imbalance, that also going to remove the term of trade movements. And when we add, we impose that these two countries also have same GDP, we also see that the welfare loss of the ratio, the welfare loss differential is also smaller here. In this exercise, we compare our model with a statics model, basically a static Armington model with roundabout productions. And we see that in this model, the welfare losses for these two countries are a lot smaller here. And in the last exercise, I'm going to show that expectations matter for the dynamics. So we re-estimate the elasticity under two alternative expectations. One is no future belief, meaning that the firm believe there's no change to their current tariff in the future. And another one is the foresight belief, that is firm always have correct expectations about future tariff. And you can see that in both response, the initial tariff response is higher than our baseline model, in which firm expect a reversal to tariff and therefore delay their response. And so on the right panel here is what the US investment look under different beliefs, and you can see that's a very different response here. Okay, so I'm totally out of time. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you so much. Happy to answer any other questions that you have.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So let's go 3-4 minutes more if there is any question online or in person. So the floor is open. Any question? Okay, so if there is no question, and we can talk outside with coffee. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.